Welcome to VLGA Connect. My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Well, hello everyone and welcome once again to TGU, the weekly panel discussion about all the news and views from around the world of local government, brought to you from VLGA Connect and proudly sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. And let me say hello firstly to Julie Reid, who's back with us on the panel this week. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Tony. Great to be back with you today.
Lovely to see you again. And Tony Raunic, of course, from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, joins us as well. Tony, how's your week been?
Been good. Been on the road a bit with new councillor inductions, Chris and Julie, but been fun.
And we might talk a little bit about that in just a moment, Tony, if you don't mind. I want to start though this week with what I think is really a massive story out of South Australia that's broken overnight as we record this, where as many as 46 councillors, and I understand 4 mayors are included in this number, are about to be declared out of office, basically because they've failed to submit a gift disclosure return in time. Tony, you mentioned to me before we recorded that you saw this and thought, oh, this will just be a procedural thing that'll get sorted, but it looks like there's going to be elections to fill vacant positions in this case.
Yeah, I thought it might have been a shot over the bow through the media by the authority there in South Australia to get, lots and lots of councillors, probably with the prompting of their CEOs, filling out disclosure forms. But no, it seems that that boat sailed and the deadline has passed, despite, I should say, lots of notices and warning, it would appear, to these
12. Well, the minister says there were 12 reminders to all those candidates during the election period. And there was, we should say, a change, as I understand, to the procedure, whereas up until this election, the CEO of each council had gathered those returns and submitted them, but it's now the responsibility of the individual to submit them. And some have suggested that might have been a factor in this. That would make sense if they're all experienced and returned councillors, I guess, but still the lesson here is to understand the obligations very, very clearly going in, isn't it?
Does sound like an onerous outcome, but then you think that in South Australia next election cycle, there'll be few councillors who miss this, given the implications this time around.
And I think, Chris, that there's a really clear message in this. I know that we've had issues of the same sort in Victoria in terms of submission of disclosures. So I think it's definitely a warning. It's definitely a let's make everybody aware how important this issue is, because if you don't adhere to it, then there's going to be ramifications. And no doubt Victoria will be looking very closely at this particular issue.
It brings back unpleasant memories for me, Julie and Tony, of a time where you might recall after a particular election cycle, a few councils were caught up in a change to the way I think it was the oath or the affirmation of office was delivered or recorded. And it looked like a lot of councils were going to be out of office, but the government enacted a change to the legislation to deal with that issue. Clearly, there's no appetite for doing that by the looks of it in South Australia. But I was in the middle of that, I'm sorry to say, and it was a pretty harrowing time. I'm not sure whether you remember any of that, but I'm forever indebted to the local member at the moment who injected some common sense into that whole discussion. But anyway, so we'll keep an eye on that, but it looks like elections for about 46 elected members are going to be happening pending appeal. So there's an appeal process, and I think they've said there'll be about a month's delay while any appeals to the South Australian Civil and Administrative Tribunal play out. And that's, I guess, to catch extenuating circumstances that might apply for some of those individuals that the tribunal might look favourably upon. So I suspect we'll be coming back to it.
Yeah, I suspect it's going to be quite a long time if there's an appeal process, and whether or not there's individual appeals for each of those councillors. I suspect that is the case. So it could be months before we hear the outcome of that.
That'll be an interesting one to watch. Of course, there are a few South Australian councils conducting second elections or by-elections because they had insufficient nominations to fill some positions. So elections are going to be around for a little while by the looks of it at the local government level in South Australia, at least for the next few months. So in Victoria, perhaps the big story this week has been the naming of the two monitors that have been appointed to the city of Greater Geelong. People will recall a couple of weeks ago, the minister said she had the intention of appointing monitors to oversee the CEO employment process, which we understood was getting to the pointy end, but clearly there's been a pause there while these monitors come in, Prue Digby and Peter Dorling. And Julie, you picked up on the point, I think, when we first discussed this. There seemed to be a hint of a longer agenda there, and that's borne out, I think, by the fact that the two monitors have been appointed for 12 months.
Normally they start at about either 3 or 6 months, and then they review that at the end of that period. They go back and they report to the minister on what's going on, and then the minister decides whether or not she's going to extend the period. So obviously in this case, they've gone, okay, there's a need for a bit longer than 3 or 6 months. So there are obviously some issues there which have not come to light yet. But interesting selection. Obviously, Prue's very well versed with being a monitor and did a great job down at South Gippsland. Peter, I don't know so much, but Peter obviously is no stranger to that part of the world. Really knows Geelong Council well, knows Geelong really well as well. So no stranger to the council or the area, which I think sounds like a great fit.
Yes, so he was one of the administrators when that council was under administration a few years back now, and was a monitor post that period as well. Not sure if you've come across or worked with Peter, Tony, but no real surprises, I think, in the calibre of the appointments there.
No, and I think, well, at least according to media articles, I think Geelong Advertiser has shed some light on perhaps some of the reasoning of the government in terms of the appointment. It appears that there was information received coming from council, be that from a council officer or a councillor, that an allegation that the names of some of the CEO candidates had been shared beyond the recruitment committee. At least that's what the media report says. I don't know if that's true.
An unnamed source, we should say, was quoted as saying that to the Advertiser.
Yeah, so which would be absolutely concerning, and you can understand why the government might feel the need to step in with some monitors.
Yeah, so it sort of comes back to something we've discussed earlier too, with this propensity to appoint monitors where there are issues, and we've talked about the, I think what people welcome as a proactive nature in making those appointments. Question is always going to be, are there enough monitors with suitable experience and skills to fill those positions? We've got a few in place at the moment, but here's an example where Prue's just finished one at South Gippsland and has now gone into to the Geelong role. So it remains to be seen, I think, where the future bank of monitors is going to be populated from.
Yeah, that's interesting, Chris. And I think LGV are certainly on top of who's around, who's available, and obviously looking for the right fit for the right councils. Yes. So yeah, look, I've got every confidence in the fact that they're collecting names as we speak, probably, of those people that are available.
One thing that's crossed my mind a couple of times is what it must be feeling like to be a candidate in the middle of this process, the uncertainty that is clearly now attached to the process. Do you reckon if you were in the middle of that process, you'd be second guessing whether you wanted to remain in it? I know it's speculation, but if it was you, Julie, what would you be thinking?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Chris. And I was thinking off the top of my head that going in and that there's a monitor that's going to be there, would you see that as, or monitors in this case, would you see that as a positive thing or a negative thing? Some councils have had the view, well, they're not really wanting a proactive monitor because it sends the wrong signal to the community and to the sector that maybe there's some issues there. So I think I would be asking lots of questions about what's going on and trying to dig and find out, why the monitors have been appointed in their view and what's going on there. But yeah, it might make me a bit nervous.
Yeah, I'm with you there, Julie. Let's move on. As with our first story, I'm sure it's not the last time that one will make the list for discussion. So, Tony, you've been in Brimbank, where there's a new councillor and a young councillor, the latest in what's a growing list of young people. When I say young, I think 21.
There's 21, Councillor Tom O'Reilly there at Brimbank. And one of our newest councillors. Interesting guy, grew up in Brimbank of Maltese Irish heritage. So, like a lot of people in that Brimbank area, from that multicultural background. Former youth councillor, so served twice on the Brimbank Youth Council. So, nice to see that progression through now onto the full council. Interestingly, an identical twin, Thomas, or Tom, and his brother Christopher actually ran for council as well last election. So the two brothers are initially unsuccessful, but on count back, congratulations to Tom, who was elected. And I got to spend a bit of time with Tom on Wednesday doing some induction training. He, like his twin brother, is a primary school teaching student, and is combining that with now with being a councillor at Brimbank. So good luck to him.
That's a fabulous story, Tony. What is your sense, without saying too much about Thomas himself, of that pathway of being involved in youth council, preparing someone for understanding the processes of local government? Is that a real plus in this case, do you think?
Well, I think it's a head start. I agree it's a head start. And I know that councils have sort of wondered about this youth council process at times. Some councils have tried it and felt it hadn't worked. But certainly in this case, in terms of that, perhaps some leadership training, exposure to the element of civics and that, it certainly seemed to light a spark for Thomas O'Reilly, and has encouraged his interest in Brimbank Council, and all strength to him. I think it's been a great process, and I think it will just improve. It's great for Brimbank to have another young councillor on board.
Yeah, so they've got a couple, of course, with the previous mayor, Jasmine Nguyen, being
correct
in that batch, I think we can say, of the younger councillors around the state.
Chris, I'm really pleased to see young people coming through. We've seen young councillors in other municipalities as well, and great programs as well. When I was working at Kingston, there was a junior mayor program, which was fantastic, which gave the opportunity for someone at that junior age of sort of around about sort of between 10 and 12, something like that, to come in and shadow the mayor for a year, to go to events, to understand a little bit more about local government. So, these are the leaders of the future that we should be nurturing, and, great to see those kind of, youth programs, as well as things like the junior mayor.
All right, what's next on the list? The Local Government Inspectorate in Victoria has released its annual report for the last financial year. So it's getting a little bit dated in terms of time, but there's an interesting story here. Tony, I'll ask you firstly in terms of the numbers that were jumping out at you.
Yeah, certainly over 200 investigations in relation to 300 odd allegations. It's interesting that about 130 warnings were issued by the Inspectorate, nearly all, interestingly, for election-related matters. And I think that, including, can I say, in relation to the failure to complete campaign donation returns. So we remember we started off talking about the onerous implications there in South Australia for a failure to complete those returns. It's not a problem that's unique to South Australia. Clearly, we've had an issue in Victoria in recent years, and the Inspectorate this time around, the approach has been to warn. I believe there were also some warnings went out to real estate agents in this regard who were filling out election voting for landlords.
That's
so
right.
For the real estate agents were actually doing the voting, and again there were some warnings issued to them. But otherwise some interesting statistics about where their investigations were directed. I don't know if you saw them, Chris and Julie, but overwhelmingly conflict of interest, 34% in relation to conflict of interest. And then the next one was misuse of position. Followed behind by, only at 6% and 2%, breaching confidential information and directing council staff at 2%. Right. So, really that conflict of interest piece is really still significant for councillors at the moment.
And that breakdown doesn't surprise me. One thing that crossed my mind, and I'm not sure if you've read more detail on this, Tony, 203 investigations completed. Silent on how many investigations are still underway, because we know there are a few matters that have been in train for quite some time. There's been a bit of publicity around some of those. Do we get a sense of 203 completed out of however many that were in train?
No, I didn't pick that up overall. I do know that because the local government inspectorate is just one of the various bodies that, if you like, oversee or regulate the sector. IBAC, for example, is another. The Ombudsman is another, and so often it's a case of the complaint going to the right organisation. I was struck with the fact that there were 0 prosecutions by the Inspectorate to date, and maybe in some of those more involved matters that are ongoing, that they might involve potential prosecutions.
Okay, anything particular jumping out at you from that report, Julie? No surprises?
No surprises. I was never really privy to, how many investigations were happening at any one time, but I know it was significant. For a small organisation, they really do a incredible job with a small amount of resources. So, and obviously that's been an issue for councils over a period of time. They've been worried about the lack of resources, maybe at at the Inspectorate, and have certainly, at LGV heard that when I was in the role. But since then, people have also raised concerns about, there needs to be more resources to be able to deal with some of these investigations more quickly as well.
Yes, because it's not really helpful to anyone when they drag on for long periods of time for,
That's right,
in most cases, understandable reasons. But a lot of it comes down to that resourcing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that's there for you to read if you'd like to dig into all things Inspectorate from the 21-22 financial year. Last week, Tony, we talked about what was happening up on the Gold Coast, where the Mayor, Tom Tate, had said he wasn't looking at introducing an acknowledgement of country to their council meetings because he described it as not efficient, and he didn't want anything else getting in the way of conducting the business of the council. There's been a little bit of an about face, and this will link to a Victorian story in just a moment. In the last week, he's now saying that at the next Gold Coast Council meeting, he'll raise the matter and consult his fellow councillors. I think there's been quite a bit of pressure brought to bear after those public statements last week.
Interesting, as you say, a bit of an about face, and be interesting to see what his councillor colleagues have to say about this. But it's placed the issue firmly, on the agenda, can I say, yes, for a conversation amongst the councillors.
I don't know how you can back away from it now, given the very public way this is playing out. Julie, how do you not introduce an acknowledgement of the country now and make a case that people would accept as being reasonable and logical not to do so.
I know. Look, this is a really tough one, and it's really sensitive in the community. It's steeped in tradition. Some of what we've seen in the past that's brought forward, but it's really, really hard to turn away from something that you've started to practice. You have to have pretty good reasons, I think, as to why, and be able to make sure that you're going to have general acceptance, I think, by the community.
And I think we made the point last week that there was something like 40% or 60%, I forget which way around it was, of Queensland councils that do or don't have an acknowledgement of country. So Gold Coast certainly isn't alone, but at least they're having another look and not waiting what was going to be well over 12 months to have the conversation about it. But what that led to in our conversation last week was around the use of council prayers at the start of council meetings. Once you start talking about acknowledgements and prayers and value statements, etc. What we didn't know, Tony, at the time we were discussing, is that there was a letter that had been put together by 21 Victorian councillors and sent off to the government. This story broke later on the Friday, calling for the government to do something to remove council prayers from being a thing at council meetings in Victoria. I said almost jokingly that I need to do a bit of a research project to find out which councils do or don't. That might end up being done for me, I think, through this.
It's a bit of the Nostradamus about you there, Chris, because you're absolutely right. We had no idea that this was about to happen. But I did see that letter that's been submitted, to the Minister, VLGA, MAV, these sort of organisations, as well, arguing that the Christian prayer at councils being perhaps inconsistent with this multicultural, multi-faith diversity of communities and those principles in the Local Government Act. I found the article in The Age really interesting. I saw two people I know really well at the same council, Banyule Council, were cited at least in there as being on opposite sides of the argument. Councillor Tom Melican said, "Look, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I think it's exclusionary to continue with the Christian prayer." His colleague Mark Di Pasquale at Banyule, I think, was quoted as having recently, moved a motion to bring the prayer back into Banyule council meetings, or at least establish it there. So clearly, and I know those two are really good close colleagues on council, there's differences of opinion. And I dare say all three panelists here, we've got our opinions on it. I remember when and it's going back to the 1990s and the early noughties when I was on council at Nillumbik, but this came up for us. I sort of saw it as an opportunity to promote diversity in a different way, and maybe so we wrote to all the local faith communities, not just the Christian ones, so the local mosque, the synagogue, the Buddhist monastery, and we implemented a roster of a revolving prayer where one of those faith leaders would come in, and it was a moment of reflection and prayer that they would lead. So that's an alternative way. I appreciate that might pose some issues for non-believers, but I think there's also instances where, for me, I think in life where we're able to respect something that we don't have a direct connection to sometimes as well.
True. What I've seen it effectively done, sorry, Julie, one sec, some councils use their interfaith groups that exist in the community to come up with a statement, a diversity, a value statement, or whatever you like, that is recognising all faiths and uses inclusionary language in place of a prayer. But it's always an emotive issue. There's usually at least one or two councillors in the group that feel very strongly about it and may not go further because the council group might have the view that unless everyone's in agreement, we're not going to change the status quo. Julie, you've had a similar experience, I think.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. And I just wanted to share that maybe some of the really multicultural councils, like, for example, Greater Geelong, who brought in interfaith leaders to do the prayer at the start of the meeting, and rotated that around, like what Tony was talking about, is a really great idea. It sort of touches then all of the broad interfaith across the community. So I think something for councils maybe to have a look at how do those really multicultural communities deal with that. I think, again, this is another one that's steeped in tradition, and we've always done it that way. And so, some people wanting to keep it, but then others saying, look, we've moved on from there. We are much more multicultural, and we need to find something new and different to represent our community. So it's got to be a decision locally by the council, and my understanding is there's nothing enshrined in legislation that stops them from actually changing what they do.
No, that's exactly right. It's a matter for individual councils, I think was the advice. And I think as we see each electoral cycle run its course, and we see councils being made up of groups of people that are more reflective and representative of the diversity of the communities, these types of discussions are going to happen more frequently. That's assuming nothing happens across the board as a result of this, but I can't quite see how that is going to happen. Other than
I wonder where it will go, where you draw the line. Councils spend money on Christmas decorations, and I can think of it, as someone from a Christian background, I understand that, but I can also, so if my council, I live in Whittlesea, if they promoted the Diwali festival, to me that would be a good thing. We have a lot of Hindus in our community, and I would think that was appropriate. And
they do.
I don't actually not necessarily share that faith belief.
Yes, and for the record, they do that.
And this comes back to as well the issue of the need for diversity on council in terms of councillors. There's going to be a move towards more diversity as we're going forward, and in that more diversity is going to come new ideas and new ways of doing things. And so we want to encourage that diversity because it's going to bring broader voices, but it's going to also bring change, and that's going to be part of it. All
right, some big issues that we've talked about there. A few news items to whip through. I'll get your comments if you wish to make one, but just so people are aware, Greater Shepparton has finally held a deputy mayoral election. This is a second attempt. The first one was in October and there was a hung vote. And the last deputy mayor, Councillor Anthony Brophy, who I must declare, we go way back to primary school, basically. Anthony is deputy mayor again. And I think what's happened there is Kim O'Keefe was running for state parliament, got elected. We knew there was going to have to be a count back and a new councillor, so they waited for that to resolve before they've had a second attempt. So congratulations to Anthony, who was elected deputy mayor this week. In South Australia, a former CEO, and I know you would have looked at this very closely with your legal eyes, Tony, a former CEO has had an unfair dismissal case rejected by the courts, and he's been ordered to pay costs estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, so pretty costly exercise. And I suspect a bit more detail came out in this than perhaps was being bargained for, Tony.
Yeah, I think this was an appeal from the original decision, so an appeal to the South Australian Supreme Court from a 2019 decision. And as a lawyer, I'm not a litigator, but as a lawyer, one of the things you often are saying to people is, if you want to roll the dice and run the appeal, can you be, what are the consequences is if you lose in terms of costs and perhaps more publicity. And we've certainly seen in the media reports just a publication, if you like, of the reasons for the original dismissal, which seemed pretty scathing, I think. Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of things here. One, don't keep questionable material on your work email drive. In this case, it's stated that this person had intimate photographs of himself and a sexual partner on his work email drive. Why? Just why? There's one reason why you should not. But also, I found this really interesting. The alleged involvement of the CEO in it doesn't say encouraging, but not necessarily discouraging senior members of staff from sending emails that were disparaging about elected members. You know, behaviours that seem to have undermined the good working relationship between the council staff and the elected members. I don't know all the detail, none of us here do, but there's not a good look there either with that stuff that's come out.
No.
And the thing that sort of resonated with me, Julie, particularly, was the Chief Justice's comment that all of this conduct, and I quote, fatally compromised the trust and confidence that was critical to the employment relationship. I think that's it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, Chris, and look, I think these messages are really critical, particularly I was out at Darebin yesterday talking to new staff who are new to local government. I'm doing some training of staff that are new to local government and talking to them about, you know, transparency and about everything is available to on your work equipment is to be FOIable. You know, please don't use that for personal use.
Yeah.
Don't have anything in there that you feel slightly uncomfortable about. Make sure you keep it very, very separate, and make sure that it's always totally professional, because, you know, the public can get access to any of this information if they want to. So please heed to that. And it was really interesting on the brink of telling them that this came out, and it was kind of like, well, there you go, you know, an example of where, you know, you've got to be so careful and so professional in your role.
Just reinforces that message, doesn't it, Julie?
Yeah.
Tony, any particular takeaways for you from this particular case?
Look, I absolutely agree with you about the use of you know, publicly provided resources for you know, for private matters, and the need to be conscious of that. And then I think taking it a step further, as Julie says, you know, the inclination to send a late night email on you know, from the work email address that might be you know, the tone of which in retrospect you might regret, encouraging all, you know, councillors, council officers to just give some pause for thought in those situations, because you know, these are, as Julie rightly says, there's a record. These things are capable of being produced through summons and FOI, and even when they're deleted from your system, they're capable of being picked up off the hard drive.
Yes, I don't think I've ever received an email with a timestamp of 2 a.m. that I've actually thought, oh, that was a nice email. Might just leave that there. Launceston City Council this week has finalised its feedback after the council elections in Tasmania last year. Of course, there were a few changes introduced, including compulsory voting for the first time. But this caught my eye. The council is recommending to the government, or is expected to, they were looking at this draft submission last night, I think, limiting the number of terms for mayors. They'd like to see I couldn't quite follow this argument. You might get this. They'd like to see 2-term limits applied to mayors, where they get elected separately to the let's say the run-of-the-mill councillor roles. And they're saying this would be more effective for succession planning. Does that make sense to either of you?
I don't know if you can be in favour of something and against it at the same time, but that's where I sort of sit.
Okay. That's called, Tony, that's called sitting on the fence.
Let me explain. It probably is, but so I think it is a good thing generally for these senior roles at council, representative roles, to be shared around in light of also which, you know, what councillor has the time, the necessary experience and capacity to be either, you know, the deputy mayor or the mayor. But I think that as a general proposition, you know, having the same mayor for 3-4 terms in a row, it begs the question of succession, just another voice, another set of views, perhaps leading the council. There might be some value in that. But then when it comes to legislating or, you know, regulating and prohibiting, you know, a mayor serving for more than 2 terms, I just wonder, there may well be circumstances at a particular council where it actually makes sense, where the other councillors don't want the role, aren't able to fulfil the role for some particular reason, or there's some particular crisis management that's going on at the council that makes sense to have some level of continuity. So I'm for the principle of changing it around regularly as a general proposition, but not really keen on seeing that mandated.
So, Tony, does your view change if I was to remind you, and I should have done this at the outset, when we talk about terms in Victoria, they're generally 12-month terms. When we talk about terms in Tasmania, we're talking, I can't remember whether it's 3 or 4 years, but you're talking about, you know, a limit of 6 or 8 years for one person being in the role of the mayor. Is that an important distinction?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that puts a different flavour on it. So we're talking about some, you know, we're talking about a prohibition that is only comes in the order of 8 years or so after 8 years of service in that role. So yeah, good point, Chris.
As we often say, it's done differently in different jurisdictions around the country, and it's always fascinating to me. Julie, do you have a view?
Oh, look, I was just going to talk about some mayors have natural leadership ability, and sometimes you've only got one standout in the group that have got those leadership qualities. So why not enable them if they are a good leader and they're doing a good job and the council, their councillor colleagues are happy with their performance, then why shouldn't they stay on for a longer period of time? I'm not too sure about the mandate thing. I think it should be really open to them earning it, to be able to then, you know, earn the vote. But yeah, so that's where I'm sitting, and I've seen some mayors with some really great leadership qualities that I think deserve to stay in there for a period of time.
As always, we'd love to hear the listeners and the viewers' thoughts on any of these topics. Please get in touch with us via the social media channels or the comment functions to have your 2 cents worth, and we may feature that in a future episode. I want to wrap things up with the things that caught your eye this week as time's getting away. And Julie, talking about mayors displaying leadership, there's a mayor in Sydney, in the city of Blacktown, that caught your attention this week.
That's right. Councillor Tony Bleasdale caught my attention on LinkedIn, leading the community charge against what he says is appalling lack of infrastructure funding coming from the New South Wales government, and particularly for a growing local government area. And he's gathered local residents together and voiced his support to them in trying to get new facilities and more funding for those growth areas. So I think the issue of the capping, again, the rate capping up there and its impact, saying that council's hands have been tied and it's becoming more and more difficult for them there to be able to deliver the services that are needed locally. So my vote this week is for Councillor Tony Bleasdale at Blacktown.
OAM, if I'm not mistaken.
OAM. That's right. Yes.
And let's not lose sight of the fact that a lot of this has to do with the fact that New South Wales is going to elections next month, and of course, councillors are being very active with their advocacy. There's one example of that. Tony, we're going down to the southwest coast for the story that caught your eye this week about not the first council to be doing something about short stay accommodation, but perhaps a slightly different approach from Warrnambool.
Yeah, that's right. Down at Warrnambool City Council, a change to the local laws this week, media article about that. As you say, not the first council to introduce annual charges for short stay accommodation providers, in this case a $400 a year annual charge on top of rates. I think we've seen some similar charges at Frankston and Mornington Peninsula. But also what caught my eye was an attempt in the local law to effect some behavioural change at those short stay accommodation places, in that there's a ban on the use of swimming pools, outdoor deckings, balconies between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. at short stay accommodation. I'm not sure how this would be policed, presumably by way of some fine or sanction that is the council levies upon the ratepayer and the owner of the land. But interesting, and I think something that many councils are struggling with at the moment is a bit of community outrage about how these facilities operate and the loss of amenity for neighbours, and interesting approach being taken by Warrnambool City Council.
And of course, the other angle that a lot of councils are talking about is, or at least trying to encourage owners of these properties to put those properties in the longer term rental market rather than the short stay. And there's obviously economic reasons why they're doing that, but we also have a housing crisis on at the
That's
moment.
correct.
And councils are trying all sorts of things to try and generate more supply in the housing market. Julie?
It is interesting, Chris, because I just don't know practically how the council are going to be able to, enforce or monitor. I suspect it'll have to be a reactive, complaints come through, but you'd have to be there in the moment to be able to witness what has gone on, to be able to then take the action. So I don't know how it's going to work practically, but I can understand why the council have done that, because there would have been a lot of pressure, no doubt, from the local community in terms of their amenity impacts. I just don't know whether that's the approach that would, that's going to work so much from an enforcement point of view. But, good on them, give it a try, see how it goes. It might open up, opportunities for other councils to take up a similar approach. We'll have to see how that.
All right, good on Warrnambool, and shout out to Andrew Mason, who's just started there as the new CEO at Warrnambool, and to Michael Tudball, who's just started as the interim at Corangamite, where I see Ruth Castrain has called a special meeting next week, the mayor, to finalise their formal position on the representation reviews. We talked about the challenges, I think, that the first round councils are finding with the timing with this. And here's a case where Corangamite's had to call a special meeting so that they can reach a formal position before those submissions close on the 22nd of February. I've got one quick one, although this could lead to a longer discussion that we might have to park. My story that caught my eye is out of Queensland just in the last 24 hours, where the CEO of the Local Government Association of Queensland, Alison Smith, has been speaking to MPs about proposed changes to the Electoral Act up there and defending the practice of councils running positive media stories during election periods in which council laws are featured. So the question was asked, is that not a misuse of ratepayers' money for an electoral purpose? And I'm paraphrasing there. She says no. She says councillors there have operational responsibilities, and as long as those stories are operational in nature and aren't specifically advocating for someone's vote, that practice should be able to continue. You wouldn't be able to do that in Victoria. So I'm filing that, Tony, under our new file we opened last week. They do things differently up there in Queensland file.
That's right. I think to me to turn on, is there a special edition of the council newsletter that's come out during the election period, or is it just in the usual cycle? Because we don't want to, favour the incumbent candidates. But yeah, really interesting.
All right. Any final thoughts from either of you before I wrap this up? We've been going for quite a while today.
All good, Chris.
Have a great week ahead, whatever you've got planned. I know you've been crisscrossing the state, Julie, and doing some wonderful work working with councils. And Tony, I'm sure you've got a mixed bag and you probably don't know what your week's going to look like from day to day, do you?
Oh, it's variety. It's the spice of life, isn't it?
Indeed. Well,
yeah, variety is great. I'm off to Manningham next week and up to Swan Hill again. So look forward to another road trip.
Excellent. All right. Well, we do appreciate having both of you on the program, sharing your insights on the news of the week from around the big, wide, wonderful world of local government. And I do want to say thank you through you, Tony, to the team at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, for your sponsorship of TGU. Got to say, I don't know whether it's this panel combination, but our viewership is growing. Don't know what's going on there, and listenership as well. So it's lovely to have all of you with us, and we hope you'll keep joining us for TGU. Here from VLGA Connect. Until next time, bye for now.